Now that we've covered the basics of polygons and ogives, in practice, polygons and ogives are generally drawn using some type of software. We're going to look at how those are drawn on Excel. We've been working with this data set about the number of hours spent on homework by a student in a week. We already developed a frequency table using Excel, and now we're going to draw a polygon and an ogive for this data. With polygons, polygons focus on the midpoints, which I'll highlight here in orange. They also focus on the frequencies. Polygons, though, need an extra point inserted on the left and the right of the graph. So I'm going to click on row 4 with a right click and do insert to insert a graph above row 4. We need that midpoint to be one class width behind the first class. Well, I can type in equals, click the 3.5, and subtract the class width, which we already found out was 4, to find out the first midpoint is going to be at negative 0.5. And we know it needs to be given a frequency of 0 for the graph. We also have to add an extra midpoint to the end. So I'll say equals, grab the last class, and add 4, the class width, to get 19.5. And its width has to be 0. I'll also highlight those in orange, so we've got all of our data for our polygon here highlighted in orange. To make the graph, I'm going to select the data values that I want and go to the tab marked Insert. There are lots of charts that you can make for this data. Click the one that looks like a scatter plot, and then select the scatter plot that has the connected dots. We now have our polygon, but we're going to have to do some editing to get this polygon to be exactly the way we want it to be. First, I notice there's no x and y axis labels. So I'm going to click the little plus and say I want the axis titles. Now we're ready to put our titles in there. The title is Hours on Homework. The x-axis was the midpoints of hours, or midpoints of time, expressed in hours. And the y-axis was the frequencies. You might notice that the x-axis, though, does not seem to match our data. While technically the values are correct, it's nice if those x values match the data values or the midpoints. So if I double-click those numbers, it opens up a box to the right of Excel to format the axis. Clicking the axes options, the 3 bars, allows me to edit the axes options. I'm going to set the minimum axis to that minimum midpoint of negative 0.5, and the maximum to the maximum midpoint of 19.5. For the units, I'm going to put the class width that we found of 4. And now you can see we end up with our polygon having those midpoints that match our data values. And we've completed our polygon graph. To make the ogive graph looks at the high value of each class. I'll highlight those in green. And the cumulative relative frequencies. I'll also highlight those in green. Remember, for the first point on the ogive, we have to include the low value. I'm just going to add that above, that 1.5 above. So now it has a cumulative relative frequency of 0. And now in the first column in green, I've got my upper limits. In the second column in green, I've got the cumulative relative frequencies. To make a graph with those, I'm going to select the first column. And then I have to hold down the Control button as I select the other green column, the cumulative relative frequency. This Control allows me to select columns that are not adjacent to each other. And now we can do the exact same process to insert a chart, click the scatter plot, and the connected line graph. And that's going to give us our ogive. It also needs x and y axis labels, so I'll hit the little plus and click Axes Titles. Put in a title, maybe Hours Spent on Homework. The x-axis I can call Time Upper Limits in hours. And the y-axis, I can call that my cumulative relative frequency. Again, I notice the x-axis doesn't match up with my dots, so if I double-click my x-axis, I get the Format Axes options again. I can click the 3 bars to go to Axes Options and set the minimum to the 1.5, which was the first bar, the maximum to the 17.5, which was the last bar, and the units to the class width of 4, and that'll line everything up so it looks exactly like I want it to for my ogive. Excel makes drawing these graphs a lot easier and also a lot more accurate so that I don't have to worry about spacing on my paper.